So section 1. So if you've not taken one of my classes before, what I do is I take the review questions, and I'll put this review on the PowerPoint up online. Anytime anyone asks me a question, I bold it. The unbolded ones are questions people did not ask me. Right? So then I just go through the bolded questions. So not the most exciting thing, but it is meant to be efficient. So the first 3 questions I'll take together. What are the characteristics of the Chinese imperial system? What problems did the government have in finding officials? How did it seek to solve them? What were the contents of the exam system? What did it consider important? What didn't it consider important? So, right, remember in the Chinese imperial system, you had an emperor who was believed to have the mandate of heaven. That meant that he and his family were chosen as the most virtuous people, so therefore they were to rule China. So heaven is benevolent, it's kind of like God chooses the best people to rule. And as such, the emperor had not only political functions, but also religious functions. The emperor is kind of this person who ties heaven and earth together. That's why I have that picture. That's the altar of heaven, where the emperor would offer sacrifice. And you notice there's no roof. It's so that the sacrifice was usually some meat or food that they burned, and that way the smoke could go up to heaven. But the emperor is connecting the two together. So, and if the emperor performed his political, ritual, and moral functions correctly, the people prospered. Chinese people were very practical, and they measured how well they were doing, or how well the emperor was doing, by whether or not they had food to eat, they had a comfortable place to live, and they were safe. They had those things. They said the emperor's doing a good job, so we should keep this guy as emperor. If the emperor started doing a bad job, heaven would send warnings, like an eclipse, or like an earthquake, or a comet, or something like that. Now, if you didn't predict those things, that meant the emperor was doing a bad job. He needs to do a better job. If you did predict those things, it meant that the emperor was in harmony with the cosmos and therefore was doing a good job. He was doing his moral ritual duties correctly. So emperors always want to figure out how to predict eclipses and comets and things like that. Now, if the emperor, though, keeps doing a bad job despite heaven's warnings, he can be overthrown. And a new family can take power in China, chosen by heaven. So that's basically the imperial system. Now the problem is the emperor needs loyal officials to help him rule, but the problem is everyone wants to be an official because it's the best job in town, especially if you're corrupt. Remember, China is big. The emperor can't be everywhere at once. That's why he needs officials. But that means if you're a corrupt official, you can just steal money, right? You can make up taxes. You can take some of the taxes and put them in your own pocket before you send them to the government. And the problem is, if you have enough bad officials, you'll have a bad government, and then people will overthrow you. Right? If you have a lot of bad, corrupt officials and you're the emperor, eventually people are just going to overthrow you. So he needs to find loyal officials. So what they did was they established an exam system to try and find loyal officials who were virtuous. Now, how do you do that, right? How does an exam show whether you're moral or not? Well, the exam was on morality, Confucian morality. And Confucius was this ancient teacher in China who focused on the importance of human relationships, especially hierarchical ones. Be loyal to the emperor. Love, honor, and respect your parents. Obey authority. That's what Confucius taught. So it kind of makes sense that would be what you'd have the exams on, right? If you have people who study this, and you have to study it really well, if you want to be an official, because you have to pass like 3 exams, only like 1% of the people could pass all 3. You had to know this stuff really, really well. And it meant it shaped your thinking. So you were more likely to be an honest, loyal person if you could pass these exams. So that's how they try to deal with this issue. This works really well, by the way, because this system goes on for about 1,500, 2,000 years, depending on how you date it. So it's effective. Now, what did it consider important? What didn't it consider important? Well, like I said, it considers morality important. It doesn't think technical knowledge is important. So you could become a government official without really understanding the law, or without understanding how tax collection works, as long as you were moral. Right? And especially really didn't test scientific knowledge, right? Moral over technical knowledge. What roles does the exam system play in China? I usually try and make things fairly clear, so that's kind of a list. It spread Confucian morality, so Chinese people had a common morality that bound them together. It encouraged people to be loyal to the Chinese emperor. That's a great way to encourage social stability, right? If everyone's loyal to the emperor. It integrated people into the empire. So as China expanded and spread, it took over more and more territory. But instead of saying to the people they conquered, oh, you guys are worthless, you're nothing compared to us Chinese, they said, hey, why don't you guys study the Confucian exams and you can become officials and you can help govern too. So it made much more sense to study than to rebel, right? If I lead a rebellion, there's a very good chance I'll die. But if I study, I could just become a part of the government and I can change it from the inside, or at least I'll have that nice position. It also provided a sense of identity to the Chinese people. It gave them a sense we're Chinese, and we have an awesome empire, and we should be willing to sacrifice to maintain that empire. Right? So Chinese people have a strong sense of identity. They're willing to sacrifice, and that's important. People, if you don't have people who are willing to sacrifice for the country will cease to exist. And all those things are really good, but the fifth one's a problem. Chinese people will focus on moral knowledge and see technical knowledge. While they'll acknowledge that it's important, they'll say it's not that important. It's secondary, right? Technical knowledge is only secondary. If you're really, really smart, study Confucianism, right? If you're not smart enough to handle Confucianism, then you can study technical knowledge. And so no one had question 6 through 9. But question 10, how did the stability the Qing brought and crops in the Americas influence China? It led to China to boom in terms of population, almost quadrupling between the year 1390 and 1700. It will also lead to increased trade, urbanization, and people will get wealthier. So basically things go really well. Right? Things go really well. And I wanted to do this to emphasize just how important China is, just how wealthy it is, so we can appreciate with how the West is able to overcome it, and then how this is going to be an issue later on. Section 13, what is Hangul? Why is it important? Remember, I have Hangul on my mug. This is Hangul right here. It's the Chinese, or I'm sorry, it's the Korean writing. Oops, I'll get in trouble with the Koreans for that. It's Korean writing, right? Remember, Koreans, before this time period, before King Sejong, the guy who ordered that Hangul be created, before this time period, Koreans spoke Korean, but wrote Chinese. Which you can imagine would be kind of difficult, right? Imagine if you had to speak English, but write French. That would be confusing. And so they developed their own alphabet. And this is important because not only did it make their lives easier, and it made it so people who were relatively uneducated could learn to write, right? If you're an educated person, it's really hard to study a whole bunch of Chinese. It also gave Korean people a stronger sense of identity, right? We're different, right? From Chinese people, we have our own writing system, and we can create our own literature. How was Korea's relationship with China different than Japan's relationship with China? All right, so Chosun Korea, Chosun is the dynasty ruling Korea, it's the ruling family at this time, had accepted Chinese Confucian culture. That meant the writing, the morality, the exam system, and all that. Now, the Korean king also accepted that he was the younger brother of China. Right? China's the older brother, Korea's the younger brother. And the Koreans offered tribute to China. Remember, tribute's like a gift you give to a superior person. The inferior is a gift the inferior gives the superior. And this was a good deal, though, for Korea because it allowed Korea to maintain its independence. Right? China, instead of saying, oh, those Koreans are a bunch of barbarians who were strange, let's go conquer them, the Chinese said, oh, they're fellow Confucians, so they're civilized, and they respect us as their older brother. As their older brother, it's our duty to protect our younger brother. Right? If someone messes with your younger brother or sister, you get to beat them up, right? Similar kind of idea. Right? The only one who can mess with my little brother is me, right? The older brother. And so Korea had an independent state, had its own army and diplomats, and no Qing officials were stationed in Korea. So Korea was independent, and is independent, but it still was heavily influenced by China, and its policy, in part, was determined by how not to get invaded by China. And you can see that because Korea is actually borders China, is very close to China, especially when China controls Manchuria. Japan, in contrast, is an island nation. And even though it's just a little bit of water that separates Korea and Japan, and a bit more of water, not terrible much, that separates Japan and China, this is a big deal. Right? This is enough that Japan is close enough that they can still borrow from China and Korea. They'll borrow all that stuff, Confucianism, all that stuff, Buddhism. They'll borrow Chinese writing. However, they're far enough away that China can't influence it as much. And so they're safe as well. So Japan will never, ever say that it is the younger brother of China. In fact, remember, the Japanese will say, we have an emperor just like China. And that made the Chinese angry because they said there's only one emperor, right? There's only one person who stands between heaven and earth as this kind of mediator. Japanese didn't care. They said, what are you guys going to do? Invade? Give it a shot. It doesn't work out well when China does invade, right? So Japan feels confident enough they can borrow without harming its own identity, right? And they will at times kind of give the Chinese a hard time. There's not a whole lot China can do about it. The last question, despite their differences, what did China, Japan, and Korea all have in common, and it was a search for peace and stability. Right? This is one reason why they're not going to be able to develop the scientific revolution. They're not interested in developing new forms of military technology. Remember, they can. Remember, the Koreans developed the turtle ships, and the Japanese used muskets, and the Chinese had those awesome cannon. But then they successfully, after the Imjin War, developed a period of peace. So they didn't need to develop all these weapons, whereas Europeans fight each other all the time. And so they developed really good weapons. So it was good for the people living then during this time, right? Having peace and stability is awesome, but the problem is it led Asia to kind of fall behind the Europeans.